Stuart, my friend, we are discussing an important book, The Psychology of Totalitarianism, and I'd love for you to tell me what made you read this book. What got it? Why did this grab your attention? And I love the way you urged me more than once to keep on. You need to read it. Have you read it? And I realized you were very enthusiastic, and I finally, when I read it, began to realize what you were about. And so tell me what it spoke to you and why it was such an important insight for you.
Sure. Well, it's great to be back, Ken, with as the old explorers here.
Yes.
And basically, one of my interests has always been the rise of the modern world and the effect of the modernity and the Enlightenment on the gospel, and how Christianity and spirituality has suffered. We looked at Albert Camus in his book, The Rebel, but I was reading something related to technology and to what's going on in the modern mindset, and I read a quote from this book. He's a Belgian scientist who had did his doctoral work in this idea of the rise of technology and its deceptive powers, but particularly because of his connection with Hannah Arendt, who, famously studied Eichmann and the rise of the Nazis and Eichmann in Jerusalem, and her famous book on totalitarianism. So I was gripped by the very idea of the psychology of totalitarianism. And how would that take shape? How is that taking shape, or has already it taken shape in our culture? And what would that mean for the church around the world, for the church in America, and for spirituality? But I knew as I got into this, I had just a sense that you would resonate from your scientific background as well as the historical, and see this as very pertinent. So I thought it'd be good for us to read and have a look at.
I'm very pleased that I read this and that you urged me to read it, because it was a sort of a thing. I'm wondering, what does he have in mind? But it's one of those books that surprises you. It creeps up and you realizes that it's giving an overview or kind of a philosophical underpinning of our culture that explains why technology, technique, the whole idea of how that rules and creates an ethos and understanding that's built upon a materialistic worldview at the end of the day.
Oh, yeah. And I think here's a little bit just from one of the early chapters where he said, talking about what he called the faith in science as the most reliable way of understanding the world. Of course, the people he was studying, he himself doesn't profess faith, although there's clearly a kind of transcendent interest in his life. But he sees all those people who do, the public world, controlling the dialogue. But he said the undercurrent of totalitarianism consists of blind belief in a kind of statistical, numerical, scientific fiction that shows radical contempt for the facts. The ideal subject of totalitarian rule is not the convinced Nazi or the convinced communist, but people for whom the distinction between fact and fiction and the distinction between true and false no longer exist. And I thought, my goodness, in the world of Brexit and all that happened in the elections in 2016 and beyond, the COVID issues, the pandemic, and the debate about science, should we take a vaccine, should we not, what is reliable, and now all the stuff we're finding out post these events, and the whole idea that public truth seems to have waned, and yet there is this blind scientism, this blind belief that somehow if someone puts on a white coat or puts up a numbers chart on a board, it must be true. And leading to this psychology, not the philosophy, the psychology of totality. That's the part I find kind of intriguing, Ken.
It is what drives the ideas, the behaviors, the fear-driven aberration that we have in our culture. And that there was a kind of a crowd psychology, a hyperphobic mindset. And this hyperphobia about things caused people to have a hermeneutic of suspicion about everything that they encountered, but yet at the same time opened to mediaized imbecility. So it's a strange combination there.
Well, and the use of fear. I mean, let's face it, we are fearful creatures, and it's very easy to use fear as a weapon. But I think the problem is when we combine the fact that we are very easily alerted to dangers from food poisoning, water poisoning, pandemics, disease, etc., etc. You combine that with our longing for security, but our blind belief in trust, which we would expect. We want to trust our government, we want to trust our media, and now in this whole process, we begin to wonder, well, who can we trust? And the question for the Christian is, where does their theological vision, where does their spirituality play in? Because it's often I think that what we saw was it was very often subordinated to these things and then played a lesser role in people's discernment or in their practice and their behavior.
Indeed. I think what happened was that people, because of the power of technology, because of the implications it has, it obviously this works, and therefore gave the idea of an authority in the whole system itself, that because these devices work, because we have a mastery over our world and our environment, it then creates this uniform understanding that therefore all those technical sources can be received with gratitude and without regard to the possible implications.
One of the concerns, and which this is of course drawing back, and this was, they forget that hundreds of hours of research and the reading people like Hannah Arendt, in other words, who tried to understand Nazism and communism. And we in the West, particularly in America, there's a naivete that we were sort of invulnerable above that. We couldn't be deceived, and so we've been blinded to the role that ideology plays. And there's a quote I want to read. Here's a piece about ideology, what he calls the credo of mechanistic materialism. This is from his book on page 17. He says, man may not realize it, but his humanity does not really matter. It is nothing essential. His whole existence, his longing and his lust, his romantic lamentations, and his more superficial needs, his joy and his sorrows, his doubt and his choices, his anger and his unreasonableness, his pleasure and his suffering, his deepest aversion and his most lofty aesthetic appreciations. In short, the entire drama of his existence can ultimately be reduced to elementary particles that interact according to the laws of mechanics. And that sounds almost exactly like Bertrand Russell. Yes. And when he talked about man, the despair that there is no meaning, it sounds like Dawkins in that we dance to our DNA. Yeah. But if that mechanistic materialism is the foundation of thought, of policy, of morals, of direction in our culture, in our media, and it is, and for many people, not for all, but it's a domineering ideology, you can see how it begins to, and we may not even be critiquing because we're not thinking apologetically, we're not thinking theologically, we're just receiving the world blindly and thereby being conformed into its image.
Bertrand Russell's idea of the firm foundation of unyielding despair, he grasped that, but the populace will not see that. He, as a philosopher, saw through the implications of a reductionistic narrative that reduced everything down to its component elements. And so this, what C.S. Lewis called, that's nothing but this, nothing buttery. Yeah, and that diminishment, though, he saw, but the populace does not. I mean, Desmet continues, and that's the very same page. At its birth, science was synonymous with open-mindedness, with a way of thinking that banished dogmas and questioned beliefs. As it evolved, however, it also turned itself into ideology, belief, and prejudice. And so therein lies its own materialistic nexus that then creates the conditions that could open one up to groupthink, to the idea of truth is determined by a majority vote, science by consensus, a very dangerous thing.
And that's where it led on as I was reading. This has got very intriguing for me, especially because I didn't realize he did his PhD work looking at examining scientific methodology and all of the failures within the scientific community. Universities around the world with a massive rate of failure and fraud, particularly in regards to measurement.
I was shocked by that. The way in which those figures can be manipulated and measurements are not actually correctly construed at all. And this idea of this measurements and with a psychologist's accuracy, this comparison, unbelievable.
He said, so here he quotes Goethe, and then he says, Johann Goethe once said, measuring a thing is a crude act which cannot be applied in any other way than extremely imperfectly to living bodies. He says, by attempting to measure the unmeasurable, measurement becomes a form of pseudo-objectivity. Instead of bringing the researcher closer to his research object, the measurement procedure leads him further away. It hides the examined object behind a screen of numbers.
Yes.
That's astonishing to me.
Yeah. And then those numbers can be played with, manipulated, and carefully selected.
Well, isn't that what we've been... I mean, we've had so many. Think of all the blogs, all the discussion, all the man-hours on the internet, all the people arguing about data and about their epistemology, their view of truth and so forth. And yet sometimes it was your facts versus my facts. Mm-hmm. And we're still struggling with the core of what is reality and how do we know?
Yes. But it's evident that groupthink that greatly diminished human flourishing as a result of COVID, for example, that he documents and shows how this folly of just buying into the sphere-driven narrative rather than to embrace an alternative understanding, which would always be then reduced to being a kind of a conspiracy theory. So it would be any objectivity or objectives rather would be described as conspiracy theorists.
But there is something going on because we all recognize, and you and I agree. I mean, you try not to be in some of the more silly voices, but this idea that there are people around who definitely want this idea of a constructed and artificial society. There are people like some of the transhumanist movement and others who basically see that nature is flawed fundamentally. So what we've got to do is supersede nature by adding to it through technological means. And yet this whole idea of trying to find some other way and using abstracts. And so you've often talked about the analogical and versus the digital. And yet we see that those who prefer the digital always want to move further and further away from the real thing. They want the virtual version. They want the supplemented version. They want the imagined version versus the actual real thing, the real flower, the real person, the real food, the real smell, the real taste, and certainly you can amplify it and multiply it, but the danger here is actually replacing it, isn't it?
Yes, he describes this as well as society becoming mechanized and industrialized in a dizzying number of ways. But what each takes place is that convenience, each convenience comes at a price. His price is a weakened connection to the natural and social environment. So there's a diminished connection with the real world and more of a digital assessment of it and manipulation of it and technological manipulations that replace an immediate apperception of the analog world and all its nuances and wonders.
And the cost on that, on actual life, human life, and I would say on church life, he says that talking about this, he uses obviously the coronavirus and then the pandemic conditions and the acceleration of digital space. But he said it has affected people so deeply. He says, this acceleration of online existence also accelerated burnout and exhaustion to the extent that some now speak of digital depression.
A loss of digital depression, yes. A loss of connectedness with a flourishing world, a real world with all those nuances.
You remember the magic. I mean, the first few times we did a Zoom call and, oh my goodness, I can be together with 30 people. But then 6 months on, when all your communication was that way, now you basically wanted to avoid Zoom meetings. And now today you do them only reluctantly, even though they're still apart. But this idea of connectivity, but a loss of humanity, a loss of a touch, a loss of a smile, a loss of the interaction when you're in a room together, the kind of banter that takes place, the silliness that can go on, and just the sheer humanness. Yes. When you remove that and think you can mediate that and replace it.
Yes, all the subtle, there's hundreds of thousands of nonverbal cues that are conveyed in a physical relationship, and when we're in the same room, seeing each other, just the eyes alone, and then the tone of voice, those things are diminished as a result. And then there's also not just the effect it's had on relationships, but also on our work, where labor becomes it changed from a cumbersome but inherently meaningful existential task into a disembodied utilitarian necessity. It's an interesting contrast.
Well, he uses the phrase, and by the way, for those of you listening, this is the book called The Psychology of Totalitarianism by Mattias Desmet. You can look it up on Amazon, but he talks about this mechanistic ideology. And I think here he's really onto something. Again, the mindset, the way that thought has been changed. And he says, mechanistic ideology always lives on credit in the future. Once perfect knowledge has been achieved and perfect technology has been mastered, it will translocate the man-machine into paradise. Yet for now, it mainly makes people sick and depressed. You know, I look at that because I'm often reading, you know, historical stuff on, say, the Soviet Union. And of course, we know the story of Chernobyl and the great Russian submarine, the Kursk, which was destroyed in a tragic accident. But this idea of this mechanized idea, tragedy could be allowed in the present because one day we would arrive at utopia. They didn't use that word, but it was the perfect socialist state. And today, I think you hear that over and over again in our films, in our television, you know, that we put up with all kinds of nonsense today. Life might be miserable, but one day we're going to get this fixed. One day we're going to arrive. That seems that we are succumbing to the ideological construct, that we are blind. We're always living in the future. But the fact that the price of the future is the destruction of the present doesn't seem to affect us.
No, it's a promissory materialism. They're saying that what's not working right now in our vantage point, you need to break through these things, and this will require a great price, but the future outcome will be much worth it. So it's kind of a utopian, as you say, ethos, and utopia, as you know, is well named. No place.
You would like this, Ken. This is, again, he quotes Hannah Arendt, and where she said, "Totalitarianism is ultimately the logical extension of a generalized obsession with science, the belief in an artificially created paradise. Science has become an idol that will magically cure the evils of existence and transform the nature of man." And that's my fundamental grief and grievance here as a Christian. I believe in science, as you do. I believe in the role of technology properly used and constrained. But the dehumanization, the idolatrous power, when science is elevated, when a type of mechanistic thinking takes over, it blinds us, as all idolatry does. And yet, the nature of idols, like Psalm 115 teaches us, is that it consumes those that worship it. We end up worshiping the idol, then the idol ends up consuming us. And this is my big concern with it, unless, as a Christian, I learn how to be in this world, not of this world, but for this world, so that I can use technological means and technological and planning tools and mechanisms as appropriate, but how to establish a certain distance, a certain non-sticky fingers, you know, not getting attached to the wrong way.
So that you can actually give place and priority to the things that matter most, which are always going to be analogical. It's going to be relationships, and that's the way our work is embedded in our very real world, rather than this artificial structure that is then imposed upon us, and the diminishment of workspace to again, a movement away from a flourishing relationship with other people, with tasks that we do, and a loss of dignity, a loss of hope, a loss of meaning for people. That seems to be very much of an existential crisis.
You know, Ken, when I was really getting very involved, or truly trying to understand the turn to the modern world and why Christianity had been displaced and being marginalized, I was very often drawn to Jeremiah. I think it was at Jeremiah 17, where it says, "Cursed is those who makes man his trust," but it does the contrast, and it'd be speaking about idolatry. And I thought this elevation of man, the elevation of freedom, minus God, was such a huge thing. And basically over time, we've seen this, the priority. Here's this desire for a master, the desire for a fixer, the desire for control. And Lewis gets this very much in Out of the Silent Planet, doesn't he? He deals with those, you know, the Ministry of Nice, the National Institute of Coordinated Experiment. But listen to this. This is Desmet in his book, on page 66. He says, "The idealization of the human intellect eventually led to an intensification of fear of disease and suffering, while interhuman relationships were marked by uncertainty and confusion. The old commandments and prohibitions were eventually replaced by a jungle of rules and regulations and a new hyper-strict morality." How can we understand this from a psychological perspective? So we didn't get free. We chose a new master, man, the measure of all things. But as we try to master our own environment, we become slaves to our regulations and our rules, because we really can't cope and we can't find spiritual freedom, because without God, without the gospel, without the cross, without the grace of Christ, without that transforming power, we bring it down to human rationality and controls, and what it does is it creates a nightmare for us.
And then, indeed, the human condition has always been, from the biblical perspective, one that of a fundamental rebellion against grace and our own desire to manipulate the environment, create our own worlds, as we would want them to be. But at what a price? And the emphasis that this strikes to me is the radical upshift, the movement away from authenticity and reality to these structures, these systems, these digitized spaces. Digital depression, an interesting idea. The concept of being isolated from our actual real relationships and real work and meaningful tasks. And this disconnection with reality itself is at an awful price. It's being paid on a worldview that actually invites us to see that's the logical implications of a materialistic worldview, whereas a theistic worldview is so much richer, it's so much more personal. It's analog, it's an embedded.
But it's so funny, with the rise of the new atheists and that movement, and that we turned into the 21st century filled with all this optimism, and yet he says since the beginning of the 21st century, a new morality has arisen from the belly of Enlightenment thinking, which in a number of respects is stricter, more vigorous, more irrational, and more hypocritical than the prior religious morality which the Enlightenment sought to obliterate in order to set people free. With the rise of the woke culture, society fell prey to implicit and explicit rules that made every detail of human interaction more precarious.
You couldn't even be sure what to say. Humor was under threat. And so, indeed, when you lose humor, there's an evidence of a fanaticism that people have succumbed to because they're terrified of offending anyone, where it means that at the end of the day, they ironically will offend other people, whether they like it or not. But they are living in a world that's no longer embedded in an authentic exchange of ideas, of at least hearing and disagreeing, agreeing to disagree, and now this kind of a totalitarian mindset, a lack of willingness to really be tolerant and to redefine tolerance.
Believing in its own certainty, believing that it's also objective and it's universal and it's rational.
Yes.
And I think those things in the modern, that's what's interesting, because often, and this book proves that, what claims objectivity is subjectivity. It's not rational, it's irrational. And it's not universal, because the science done in China and the science done in Saudi Arabia is still science using certain, but it will be shaped by local beliefs and values and ideologies brought to the scientific process.
It's not as objective as they might like to want us to.
So as if we're appealing to some universal standard, that's the frightening thing. It blots out the subject, and yet that subjective is very, very important in the interpretive process, isn't it?
Well, what takes place is then the loss of nuance, the loss of exchange of ideas, the loss of the give and take of truth and understanding another points of view.
Loss of humility?
Of humility, this arrogant quest for everybody has to think right. It's kind of a group speak and group think.
There's one area in particular, Ken, when he goes on to the whole idea of regulation mania, and this is where the thing went, but I found some of this a bit disturbing because it's all too real. He talks about in order to reduce unease and frustration in social spaces, we make more rules, protocols, and procedures. He says regulation mania, as manifested in government bureaucracy, attempts to render social interactions rational and logical by squeezing them into performed templates. In this respect, the ideal bureaucrat is identical to a computer. They strictly adhere to the logic of their system without being distracted by the individuality of the people they assist. And that dehumanization, that's, I guess, at the bigger level, and this makes me think about Revelation here. It makes me think about, in some sense, though we don't fully know all the meanings of all the metaphors in the picture, but the idea that somewhere at some time there's going to be some kind of system of domination and control and observation. And now you see in our time that we have lived through, we have lived to see something rise that has this incredible power, but it's this, like Nicola Sturgeon, who was the First Minister of Scotland that recently resigned, thank goodness. But at one point she called her, well, Scotland's #1 mammy, as if I'm the mother of the country. And that paternal, or in that case maternalistic vision of somebody in power who thinks it's my job to nurture and care for these little morons or these people who don't know what they're doing. And you give them a technology that can do that.
Yet that cannot be applied very consistently. Again, because keeping up with the rules is an impossible task. They're increasing in volume. He calls it rogue gang totalitarianism and technocratic totalitarianism. This spectacular increase in administrative jobs and the order of these extreme results that lead to actually greater inefficiencies and loss of excellence.
So is it possible then that what we're talking about is an increasing delusion, a delusional mindset that is fostered on the back of technology and scientism as an ideology that is basically fed into our system, and so often we end up absorbing that uncritically, because unless we're rooted in God's glory, in God's way, in God's word, in the story that guides us, we tend to just uncritically receive this and end up being, unfortunately, conformed to its image.
That's correct. So it's all left brain thinking. There's no right brain at all. There's no poetry. There's no mystery at all. And yet people desperately need that. And it's a thing to see in a world of grace that has been granted to us and we have a biblical vision of what life looks like, but it requires that revelation from God to reveal a top-down understanding of what human flourishing was meant to be and what can drive and make that occur because of the ultimate relational being that we love and serve. But at the same time, without that, you just hopelessly lost in a thing that it evaporates or it dissolves itself.
Yeah, and that, in fact, he says, quoting Hannah Arendt, he says, the chief characteristic of the mass man is not brutality and backwardness, but his isolation and lack of normal social relationships. It's on page 94. That's pretty telling to me that's kind of where we're ending up at the moment, and why, again, the gospel and church and community actually plays a huge part, that the absolute need for fellowship, for relationship, for interacting, for love, for service, for care, for just embodied living is so vital as a resistance to this kind of thing.
This understanding of a totalitarian state grounded in the social psychological process of mass formation, again, Hannah Arendt's anticipation of that process is it's such a profound revelation of the surveillance society, the government organized channels, the technocratic totalitarianism that is now becoming exceedingly more used and more accepted, but actually diminishes our understanding because we lose our individuality through mass formation.
To bring this maybe back to some resistance. Obviously, he wrote this book as an academic would do, to inform, and he's telling us that we need to resist this, and he himself turns to some kind of transcendence in the end, but he doesn't really get the God factor, although he does quote Max Planck towards the end of the book. But I mean, what were your thoughts then, Ken, as you read this? I mean, I think when you read these, even talking about this, we know this could become very heavy and people think, oh my goodness, what are we in? But it doesn't change anything about God and what God is doing, does it? I mean, it's the historical reality we live in. It's the moment we must face, but it doesn't change the promises, the presence, or the power of what Christ is doing.
That's correct. So, but it is a good analysis of new developments that are associated with what I believe are going to be the kinds of things that Jesus described at the end of the age and his coming, but ways we could not have anticipated before. To summarize, I found a great summary of the book, by the way, on page 147. And this would be helpful for us to see again how this contextualizes the mechanistic, and here's the key, mechanistic ideology has put more and more individuals into a state of social isolation, key word, unsettled by a lack of meaning, then free-floating anxiety and uneasiness, that's another component that can be, all of these can be used, you see, as a manipulative device, free-floating anxiety and uneasiness, and then as well as the latent frustration and aggression. These conditions lead to large-scale and long-lasting mass formation. And this mass formation in turn led to the emergence of totalitarian state systems. So it's really, these are symptoms of a mechanistic ideology. They're social symptoms that reveal, I think, a false view, a false grasp of the world and the universe. And then he quotes various scientists who actually have an alternative perspective. And so he quotes a variety of writers who actually think this thing through. And his quote from Niels Bohr that you mentioned before, it was very helpful because he describes that in a way that's a little bit more than I think he himself would have embraced. Let me find that for you. He also talks about the placebo and nocebo effect, which is pretty amazing as well. But here, and his quote, he's referring to Max Planck, and he's on Albert Einstein, Niels Bohr, and he's on Heisenberg and others. And that there's a kind of a convergence of understanding that there's more to this world than it might otherwise have appeared. But he speaks about we must assume behind this force, as Planck writes, the existence of a conscious and intelligent mind. This mind is the matrix of all matter. Now, Planck goes beyond what I think our writer would say when he adds both religion and science require a belief in God. For believers, God is in the beginning, and for physicists, he is at the end of all considerations. And to the former, he is the foundation. To the latter, the crown of the edifice of every generalized worldview. I think it's a wonderful statement because he really talks about, therefore, the need for more of what he calls a mystical worldview, and that the world constitutes an irresolvable mystery. And our hubris that we suppose we can understand everything on our terms and reduce things to our effects is an arrogance that prevents us from seeing truth, that we are not able to see mystery and transcendence because we want to control, we want to diminish the offers of grace and control life and actually overcome the Tower of Babel on our own terms with our own technique and so forth. We see the new Tower of Babel in our own time. But at the same time, this gives me a greater sense of appreciation and apprehension. This book kind of ties together. I see why mass hysteria, phobic
these things are rising
events and amplified by technologies of social media and other things where people can lose their capacity to think clearly, to think rationally, to think with a cogency and an independence rather than being mediaized into that imbecility that the world provides for us.
Here's a good word then, probably maybe to wind us up, but from Max Planck, he said, both religion and science require a belief in God. For believers, God is the beginning, and for the physicists, he is the end of all considerations. To the former, he's the foundation. To the latter, the crown of the edifice of every generalized worldview. That God existed before there were human beings on earth, that he holds the entire world, believers and non-believers, in his omnipotent hand for eternity, that he will remain enthroned on a level inaccessible to human comprehension, long after the earth and everything that is on it has gone to ruins. Those who profess this faith, and who, inspired by it, in veneration and complete confidence, feel secure from the dangers of life under protection of the Almighty, only those may number themselves among the truly
That's an incredible statement, because I never saw that Planck say that elsewhere, and that's so clear. It's an expression that's richer than I had normally seen. Others like Heisenberg and Schrödinger and de Broglie and Planck and Niels Bohr, Pauli and Eddington and James Jeans, all had but they all had something of a grasp, though, and all of them had what he says is a mystical worldview because they were confronted in their research with objects that pointed to an irresolvable mystery. So and that's been my whole thinking, of course, as I study the natural world. The more we know of this world, or the micro, midi, and macrocosms, the more we realize how little we do know. And it points to irresolvable mysteries. If we were humble ourselves enough to realize we are surrounded by things we can't even comprehend, then we would humble ourselves and realize that we are agents by God's grace, as stewards and agents who are here for a purpose, and who are called then to glorify Him by being sub-creators, not creators ourselves, for creating the world in our own image, but rather actually pleasing the one who made all things beautiful and good and true.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's a lot to think about. This is a sobering book, and we'd maybe go on and talk maybe in our next time about some of there's another article we were looking at that is related to this. We might think about the theology, but for now, we turn our eyes to the King and to our hope in Him. We trust in Him that despite human hubris, there is hope in the true, living, and only God.
The King eternal, immortal,
invisible.
Amen.
Amen.